What do you think about the idea of universal basic income? And what do you think about, for example, let's say, because to me, like this technological progress, it's super fast, and with, potentially artificial intelligence coming into play, it can play out really well, I think, or it can play out really badly.
Yeah.
Without sort of fear mongering of, machines killing us and stuff like that. But just thinking, just in terms of jobs, identity, people's happiness, their place
Correct.
in a society, it can clear things up for us, and it can free up the time, or it can just make it even more complex, even more unequal, and even sadder. So
Yeah.
what do you think about if we get a chance to work less? And you can see examples of that in Scandinavian countries on a local level. Their social benefits can be enough for a decent living,
Yeah.
and then they are, the happiest countries also, by
Yeah.
coincidence or not. So
Yeah.
what do you think just about what do you think about that?
Well, I think again, you need to look at the culture of the country. I mean, I lived in Sweden for a while, and it
Hmm.
was very, very clear that the culture of the country is very much about looking after the people, genuinely. Again, it was, I just had my little perspective on it, but people who were in so-called ordinary jobs, what I saw was that the standard of their homes was, I don't know whether they owned them or rented them, or whatever, but it was excellent. It wasn't good. It was excellent.
Hmm.
So it's like, what is the commitment? I mean, if you then look at the UK, my impression of the UK is that actually I don't get that politicians care. The interesting
Yeah.
thing with Corbyn at the moment is that he might be somebody who actually cares, but by and large, there is a tough stance which comes out of our culture, and I, for one, I don't like it. It's not something that I warm to. And I also think that, as I said earlier on, that has a negative impact on the family, because you end up, it's like, well, I've got to be number one, you've got to compete with everybody else, and yada, yada, yada. And the problem with that is that when you're in a culture whereby, well, you've got to be a winner, is that by definition, if you're not a winner, then you're a loser. And
Hmm.
so there's a huge amount of castigation with regards to people who are either struggling or whatever, and assumptions and blah, blah, blah. Now, some of it is true. But part of the problem with that is that when you're then in a culture that doesn't value its citizens, then people are going to go, well, why the hell should I contribute? One of the things, again, that I find interesting here in Spain is that, I mean, I know their economy is, it ain't great. They had to have a handout of goodness knows how many hundreds of billions from the EU. But one of the things that they do here is that if you're, and I understand this, I don't know this for true, but I think if you're unemployed for 6 months, then you actually pick up a broom and you start, looking after your local place. You put on some reflective gear and you become that. Now, to me, when you go into a little village like the one next to where I am, it's beautiful. It's well looked after. They take pride in it. I mean, obviously their major industry is tourism as well, so you have to add that into the equation.
Hmm.
But I also see the interesting thing is that the people that are going out and planting the plants and sweeping the streets and doing what they need to do, there's no kind of resentfulness there. It's very much part of their social background.
Hmm.
So if you've got that as a background culture, then that's great. But if you've got as a background culture that you've got places which are increasingly becoming ghettoized, I mean, I think that this is, a dark perspective. But when I look at the United States and when I look at the UK, what I see, because of the culture of, got to be a winner and all this kind of stuff, is that there will be towns and large areas which will become the equivalent of ghettos, whereby the rule of law will be, kind of there. I think it's already happened in the UK to a certain extent. You will get increasingly robotic, automated policing, scanning, CCTV and all this kind of stuff. But by and large, I just think that people will be left to get on with it for the most part, because I don't relate the culture from government down as being one of caring. I see it as being one of control. So I think that's where you have to start with what's the baseline culture.
Hmm. I think in one of the books I read and reviewed, Peter Nowak is talking about Denmark, and then he's saying that the biggest difference in terms of why people there are, you know, happy, and then people in other places are not, is the level of trust. And that comes back to what you were saying about the government and caring for the people.
Correct.
In Denmark, people trust the government and the local authorities to look after them.
Yes.
And they
Yes.
also trust each other as individuals. And then
Yes.
the level of trust in so you know, high-performing economies like the UK and the US is super duper low.
Yes. And also, I'd be really interested to see what the culture was in their, if they have the equivalent of parliamentary chambers, because when you look at what goes on in the House of Commons, frankly, I think it's embarrassing. I think it's shameful. I think it's pathetic. You know, it's little more than children squabbling and name calling and not answering questions and doing all this kind of stuff. Whereas you see in the Scandinavian countries, it seems to me that there's a huge amount of logic and rationale that goes on. I'm not saying that, of course, people don't play politics. That is what politics is about. But I think that the intention behind it is very much of caring, rather than, I would suggest, in the UK and certainly in the States, it's predominantly about power.
Mm-hmm. Do you think then, as a goal, for example, with AI, a lot of people are talking about not working as a goal, right? As a goal of its own. We're going to get to a place where the economic situation, the abundance of wealth is such that we don't have to work anymore. Do you think that is a feasible goal and a good goal to set?
I don't think it's a good goal to set. I think the shift is in terms of not needing to, from a point of view of financial security. If my belief is that the bulk of the population are people that want to have a satisfying life. I think they want to have security that underpins it and whatever. So that I think is the starting point. It's always the bulk. You're always going to have, there is this constant 80-20 rule, which just, I don't know why, but it upholds in almost every walk of life. That 20% are going to look to strive for something more, and 80% will tend to kind of go, no, I'm happy with my lot, which is great. So don't fight it, because that seems to be embedded in our nature. But the most important thing is that, and I think this is part of the struggle right now, because people are struggling, is that even though you've got far more people who are far more affluent, I think you've got far more people that are struggling big time. The differential between the so-called middle class and the working class is getting erased. You know, the upper middle class and upwards is getting more and more defined and more wealthy. And the rest, I think, are sliding a little bit more further down into struggle and staying afloat. So for me, it's then looking at, okay, if you remove the need to work from a financial point of view, the biggest issue is having a sense of whether it's purpose or meaning or contribution, because it's an absolute categoric fact. If you have people, this is what I found out here, you know, listen, this is beautiful, right? But if I sit here and I do nothing, I start to stagnate, get bored, vegetate. Depression can certainly become an issue, because it's just like, well, what, you know, what do you do? You know, and it's also why, certainly in this part of the world, certainly amongst the expat community, alcohol plays a significant part. Because, well, what you do is you go along and you have a drink and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So to me, it's more about the meaning and the purpose. How can you contribute? Now, that brings in a truly fascinating question in terms of society, and that's why I say, you know, it needs to transition and change really, really fast. But if you gotta be a winner as the baseline, that's going to be really, really hard. Because if you've then got, as I said, this almost like a social stigma, you know, whereby universal basic income is something which is handed out to everybody. Never mind the cost of that. I think in the United States, if they did that, it would be an additional 14, I can't remember, it was billion or trillion or something, but a vast amount of money. Then you've then got to start looking at that in terms of, okay, so what are you going to contribute towards? Because you can't, for all sorts of reasons, but primarily well-being, you can't have people just sitting around taking money and doing nothing at all. Now that does become fascinating. And this is what I mean about moving away from doing to being. So for instance, we know that in the UK, the elderly population, huge amount of suffering from loneliness and isolation. You know, it's like, so what could you do about that as one example? So that's where it becomes intriguing, because it's an, okay, so what social enterprises can now be opened up for the well-being of people? But that's why the culture is essential, coming back to that, because if you go, well, you know, you grow up in a society where the bulk of society is pointing a finger at you going, well, you're a loser because you're not a winner, you've then got to deal with that. So the culture of universal basic income and people accepting that it's not that you're out of a job and you're unemployed, it's actually that the new status is that people accept that the bulk of people don't work. Amen.